Don't leave, Elena. We finally finished the room for you.
The inheritance arrived not in a casket or a bank statement, but in a heavy, grease-stained tube of vellum blueprints smelling of wet earth and ancient dust. Elena had returned to the sprawling, Victorian estate of her childhood only because the state mandated the liquidation of her father's eccentric estate. The house, a jagged silhouette against the gray bruised skies of the Pacific Northwest, had always felt less like a shelter and more like a physical weight pressing down on her lungs. It was a labyrinth of oak-paneled hallways, drafty corridors, and rooms that seemed to shrink or expand depending on the time of day. Memories of her youth were stained with the sensation of being watched not by eyes, but by the house itself. She remembered the way the floorboards would groan under no weight at all, and the way her father would press his ear against the wallpaper in the dead of night, his face twisted into a mask of frantic, sweating concentration dots. Sitting in the dim light of the study, Elena unfurled the blueprints. They were dated 1954, hand-drawn with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. Her eyes traced the familiar outlines of the kitchen, the grand foyer, and the winding staircase. But as she moved toward the structural core of the building, her breath hitched. In the dead center of the first floor plan sandwich between the library and the formal dining room lay a perfect 10 by 10 square. It was a void. There were no doorways leading into it, no windows looking out, no vents, no plumbing, and no electrical conduits. On the paper, it was simply a black ink box, an architectural aneurysm that should not exist. According to the measurements of the hallway, I walked past that specific section of wall thousands of times. To any casual observer, it was merely a thick structural pillar or a utility chase. But the blueprints told a different story. It was a room, a hollow, isolated lung in the middle of the home. The realization sent a cold shiver racing down her spine, a sensation like a razor blade sliding beneath her skin. She grabbed a measuring tape and a flashlight, her heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. The hallway outside the library was silent, the air heavy with the scent of floor wax and rot. She measured the distance from the library door to the corner, then compared it to the dining room wall. The math didn't lie. There was a discrepancy of exactly 10 feet. A massive hidden pocket of space set just inches behind the plaster and lath. She pressed her ear against the wallpaper. At first, there was only the sound of the wind rattling the window panes and the distant, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. Then the silence changed. It became heavy, textured. From the other side of the wall came a sound so faint it was almost a vibration, a slow, wet, dragging intake of air. It was a breath, long, ragged, and wet, as if passing through a throat clogged with honey or fluid. Inhale, pause, exhale. It was steady. It was rhythmic. It was alive. Terror, cold and visceral, rooted her to the spot. This wasn't the sound of a settling house or wind in the pipes. This was the sound of biological function. Something had been sitting in the dark, windowless core of this house for decades, breathing the same stagnant air, existing in a state of perpetual hidden stasis. She thought back to her father's behavior, his refusal to ever hang a picture on this specific wall, the way he would move the furniture to block the thumping sounds she'd hear as a child. Claiming it was just the pipes, he hadn't been protecting her from the house. He had been a jailer or perhaps a guardian. Elena's fingers brushed the floral pattern of the wallpaper. It felt loose. She peeled back a small corner, revealing the gray, crumbly plaster beneath. Her breathing stopped. The sudden absence of the sound was more terrifying than the sound itself. It felt like the thing on the other side had noticed her, like it was now pressing its own ear against the same spot, listening to the frantic thud of her pulse. She backed away, the flashlight beam trembling in her hand. As she reached the end of the hallway, a low, guttural vibration shook the floorboards, a sound like a heavy weight shifting in deep mud. Driven by a mixture of ancestral trauma and a desperate need for the truth, she ran to the basement to find a sledgehammer. The house seemed to grow colder as she descended, the shadows in the corners stretching out like reaching fingers. She found the tool leaning against a rusted boiler, its head pitted with age. As she climbed back up the stairs, the breathing resumed. Louder now, more insistent, accompanied by a soft, rhythmic thudding thump-thump. Thump-thump like a second heart beating in the belly of the architecture. She stood before the wall in the hallway, the sledgehammer heavy in her grip. Her father was dead. The secrets of the house were hers to exhume. and the sensation of being watched had reached a fever pitch. She raised the hammer, her muscles screaming with tension. With a primal cry, she swung. The hammer connected with the plaster, the sound echoing through the empty house like a gunshot. A small hole opened and a puff of air escaped her that was hot, humid, and carried the unmistakable cloying stench of raw meat and ancient, unwashed skin. Ellen appeared through the jagged opening into the absolute blackness of the hidden room. She clicked on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark. She expected to see a stowaway, a hidden squatter, or perhaps a gruesome secret from her father's past. But as the light hit the center of the 10 by 10 space, her knees buckled. The room wasn't empty, but it didn't contain furniture. The walls, floor, and ceiling were covered in a thick, pulsating layer of translucent, vein-streaked membrane, and in the center of the room, half fused into the floor, was a massive, pale mound of flesh that moved with every wet breath. As the light hit the mound, a single, oversized human eye, clouded with a milky cataract, snapped open in the center of the mass and fixed directly on her. The light from Elena's trembling flashlight didn't just illuminate the room. It seemed to violate it. The massive, milky eye didn't blink. It didn't track the light with the rapid movement of a startled animal. It simply stayed fixed, a pale, wet orb embedded in a landscape of undulating, translucent fat. The stench that rolled out of the breach was now overwhelming, a mixture of copper's stagnant sweat and something sweet like overripe fruit left to liquefy in the sun. It was the smell of a metabolism that had been running in the dark for half a century. Elena tried to scream, but the air in the hallway felt like it had been sucked into the vacuum of the hidden room. Her throat tightened, producing only a dry, raspy wheeze. She watched in paralyzed fascination as the membrane coating the walls began to ripple in response to her presence. It wasn't just a covering. It was an extension of the thing in the center. The veins within the walls throbbed with a rhythmic, purple light, pumping some thick, unseen ichor through the very skeleton of the house. The blueprints hadn't just depicted a hidden room. They had been a diagram of an organ. The mound of flesh, the heart of this architectural tumor, began to shift. It wasn't a quick movement. It was the agonizingly slow metamorphosis of something that had forgotten the geometry of a human body. A limb, or what used to be a limb, unfolded from the pale mass. It was long, multi-jointed, and covered in a fine, colorless down. It ended not in a hand, but in a series of fused, tapering digits that scratched wetly against the floorboards. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound was a direct echo of the scratching Elena had heard through the walls as a child. As the creature moved, the wallpaper in the hallway began to bulge. The house was reacting. The lath and plaster behind Elena groaned, and she realized with a jolt of pure, electric terror that the 10 by 10 room was expanding. The creature wasn't just living in the house. It was eating it, replacing the timber and insulation with its own expanding biomass. The breathing she had heard wasn't just coming from the room. It was coming from the vents, the floorboards, and the ceiling. The entire estate was a lung, and she was standing inside the throat. A low, vibrating hum began to emanate from the creature's mass. It wasn't a vocalization so much as a resonance that rattled Elena's teeth in their sockets. Through the hole she had smashed, she saw the creature's face begin to emerge from the folds of skin. It was a terrifying mosaic of her own family's features. There was the sharp, hooked nose of her grandfather, the high, elegant cheekbones of her mother who had disappeared when Elena was 6, and the wide, panicked mouth of her father frozen in a permanent, silent shriek. This wasn't a monster that had moved in. This was a biological archive. The multi-jointed limb reached toward the hole in the wall, the tapered digits testing the jagged edges of the plaster. Elena finally found her footing and backed away, stumbling over the discarded sledgehammer. She scrambled toward the library, but the door wouldn't budge. The wood had swollen, or perhaps it had been fused shut from the other side. She looked down and saw a thin, pink filament of flesh weeping through the keyhole. The house was sealing itself. It was becoming a stomach dot. She ran for the front door, her boots thundering against the floorboards, which now felt soft, almost spongy, beneath her feet. Every step felt like treading on a tongue. She reached the foyer, the grand space now draped in thick, sticky webs of the same translucent membrane she had seen in the hidden room. The front door, a massive slab of oak, was being pulled inward by thick, muscular cords of tissue that had erupted from the doorframe. Elena gripped the brass handle, pulling with a strength born its survival instinct. The door groaned, a sliver of the cold, gray Oregon afternoon peeking through the gap. But as she pulled, a wet, heavy weight landed on her shoulder. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The smell told her everything. The humid, meaty heat of the creature's breath was right against her ear. The voice distorted, layered with a dozen different pitches. Yet unmistakably her father's whispered through a throat filled with fluid. "Don't leave. Elena, we've finally finished the room for you." As the door slammed shut and the locks turned with a wet, fleshy click, the floor beneath her feet began to liquefy, her boots sinking into a carpet that was rapidly turning into warm, living skin. The sensation of the floor turning into skin was not a metaphor. It was a physical, terrifying metamorphosis. Elena felt the warmth of the house's flesh through the soles of her boots, a sickening, elastic pull that resisted every movement. The grand foyer, once a monument to Victorian architecture, was now a throat. The walls were no longer wood and plaster but a dark, throbbing purple, slick with a fine film of mucus. The chandeliers hung like vestigial organs, their crystal babbits tinkling with the rhythm of the house's deepening. With inhalations, the creature the central mass did not pursue her with the speed of a predator. It didn't have to. It was the environment itself. The long, multi-jointed limb that had touched her shoulder began to retract, pulling her backward toward the center of the house. Elena clawed at the air, her fingernails catching on the membrane-covered banister, tearing a shallow rent in the tissue. Instead of sawdust, the house bled a thick, pale yellow lymph that smelled of copper and old medicine. She was dragged past the library door, which was now completely obscured by a curtain of pulsing veins. The architectural blueprints she had left in the study were likely being digested. Papering dissolving into the house's expanding memory. She realized with a jolt of horror that the 10-by-10 room wasn't just a physical space. It was a blueprint for her own consumption. Her father hadn't been building a room. He had been cultivating a successor. The hallway narrowed. The walls were closing in, the distance between the floor and ceiling shrinking as the biomass swelled. It was a claustrophobic nightmare rendered in living tissue. Elena felt the pressure against her ribs, the house's muscles squeezing the air from her lungs. The light from her flashlight was dying, the battery struggling against a strange, electromagnetic hum that vibrated from the creature's core. In the failing beam, she saw the archive more clearly. The faces in the flesh were not just static images. They were conscious. Her mother's cheekbones shifted as the mouth beneath them began to work, a silent, wet gasping for air. Her grandfather's hooked nose twitched. They were all there, layered like sediment in a canyon of fat, their individual identities being slowly eroded by the house's collective metabolism. And now there was a new indentation forming in the wall of smooth, featureless depression exactly the size and shape of Elena. The house began to speak again. But it wasn't just her father's voice. It was a chorus of everyone who had ever lived and died within these walls. It was a vibration that bypassed her ears and resonated directly in her marrow. Stay, join, complete the square. She reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the cold, jagged edge of her father's heavy brass lighter. It was a relic of his old life, before the house had fully claimed him. With a desperate, primal scream, she struck the flint. The flame flickered, small and fragile in the humid, oxygen-depleted air. She pressed the fire against the thick, pulsing vein near her face. The reaction was instantaneous. The house didn't just feel pain. It recoiled with a violent, seismic shudder. A high-pitched, ultrasonic shriek tore through the hallways, the sound of wood snapping and flesh searing. The grip on her shoulder loosened as the creature retracted its limb. The tissue blackening and curling away from the heat, Elena scrambled forward, the floorboards beneath the skin carpet groaning as the house entered a state of shock. She wasn't heading for the front door anymore. It was a wall of solid muscle now. She was heading for the kitchen, where the blueprints had shown a secondary utility shaft. If the house was a body, the shaft was its spine. She threw herself through the doorway, the kitchen smelling of burnt fat and ozone. The stove was half sunken into the floor, the metal glowing with a dull, internal heat. She found the small wooden door to the dumbwaiter, now covered in a thin, translucent film like a cataract. She kicked through it, the wood splintering into the wet dark of the shaft. As she pulled herself into the narrow vertical tunnel, she looked back. The creature was no longer confined to the hidden room. It was flowing through the hallway like a slow-motion tidal wave of pale, unblinking eyes and grasping digits. The 10 by 10 square had finally burst, and the contents were reclaiming the entire floor plan. Elena began to climb, her hands slipping on the grease and limb-slicked walls of the shaft. Above her, she could hear the attic, the brain of the house beating with a frantic, terrified rhythm. But as she reached the second-floor landing, she felt a cold, wet hand wrap around her ankle. It wasn't a limb of the creature. It was a human hand, thin and skeletal, emerging from the very wood of the shaft. Elena. A new voice whispered her own voice, but older, tired, and sounding as if it were coming from the bottom of a deep well. Don't go up. The attic is where it keeps the hunger. Go down. Go to the roots. The hand pulled, and the floor of the shaft gave way, dropping Elena into a vertical abyss of darkness, leaving her screaming into a throat that was already beginning to swallow her whole. The fall was not a plunge into a basement, but a descent into the house's subconscious. Elena didn't hit concrete. She landed on a mound of soft, damp earth that felt like it was laced with a million tiny, hair-like nerves. The air here was freezing, smelling of ancient peat and the sharp, metallic tang of the earth's deep minerals. Her flashlight, cracked but miraculously still functional, flickered to life. She was beneath the foundation. The 10 by 10 room above was the heart, but this was the root system. The blueprints had omitted the substructure, but here it was, a vast, vaulted cavern of twisted, calcified bone and thick wooden taproots that grew upward, piercing the floorboards of the house like the teeth of a trapped animal. The roots were translucent, and through their skin, Elena could see a slow, rhythmic flow of dark fluid being drawn from the ground and pumped toward the pulsing mass. In the center of the house, the hand that had pulled her was still attached to her ankle. She looked down and saw a figure partially merged with a massive vertical root. It was her father, or what remained of him. He wasn't the monster she had seen upstairs. He was the filter. His body was stretched thin, his skin like gray parchment, his veins glowing with that same sickly purple light. He was the one keeping the creature fed so it wouldn't have to consume itself. His eyes opened, and for a fleeting moment, the architectural madness cleared. He didn't speak with his mouth. The vibration came from the root he was fused to. He told her the truth in a silent, telepathic scream. The house wasn't a building. It was an entity from a time before geometry, a shapeless hunger that had been lured into a 10 by 10 cage of iron-reinforced wood by her ancestors. But the cage had become a shell, and the shell had become a home. Every generation had to provide a center, a living soul, to act as the architect of the house's physical form. Her father's grip tightened, but not to hold her back. He was guiding her hand toward a jagged, black stone protruding from the cavern floor, the cornerstone of the original 10 by 10 cage. It was etched with symbols that seemed to hurt her eyes, a language of sharp angles and impossible curves. Break the geometry. His voice vibrated through her bones. Break the square, and the circle returns. Above them, the ceiling of the cavern, the floor of the house began to groan and buckle. The creature had realized she was in the roots. A massive, wet tentacle of meat burst through the floorboards, its multi-jointed digits frantically searching the dark for her. The house was screaming now, a cacophony of breaking timber and wailing voices that shook the very earth. Elena grabbed the sledgehammer she had somehow kept through the fall. She stood before the black stone, the primary anchor of the house's physical reality. The creature's limb lashed out, catching her across the ribs, throwing her against the cold, wet wall of the cavern. She felt her bones snap, a hot bloom of pain radiating through her chest. She crawled back to the stone, the taste of copper in her mouth. The house was collapsing inward, 10 by 10 room expanding so rapidly it was tearing the outer walls apart. The Victorian facade was shedding like dead skin, revealing the raw, pulsating meat beneath. With the last of her strength, Elena swung the hammer. The impact was silent. No crack of stone, no echo. Instead, the world turned inside out. The black stone shattered into 1,000 shards of absolute shadow. Purple light in the roots vanished. The screaming stopped. There was a moment of perfect, terrifying stillness. Then the house began to fold out. It wasn't a collapse. It was a reversal. The walls, the flesh, the eyes, and the history of the estate began to pull toward the 10 by 10 center, as if being sucked into a black hole. Elena watched as her father's form was pulled upward, a look of profound relief finally washing over his ravaged face as he dissolved into the vacuum. The meat, the wood, and the trauma were all being compressed into a single point of non-existence. Elena was thrown back by a sudden, violent burst of pressure when she opened her eyes. She was lying on a patch of barren, scorched earth. The house was gone. The Grand Victorian estate, the hidden room, and the creature were all erased. In their place sat a perfect 10 by 10 square of charred, blackened dirt. Nothing grew there. No birds flew over it. It was a scar on the world, a void where a nightmare had been cauterized. She stood up, her body aching, her mind a fragmented mirror of the horrors she had seen. She looked at her hands and saw the fine, purple lines of the house's veins still tracing paths beneath her skin. She had broken the house, but she had been its inhabitant for too long. She walked away from the scorched square, heading toward the road. But as she reached the edge of the property, she stopped. She felt a familiar rhythmic vibration in her chest. Inhale, pause, exhale. It wasn't coming from the ground. It wasn't coming from the air. Elena looked back at the empty, blackened square of earth. Then she looked down at her own stomach. Beneath the fabric of her shirt, the skin moved. A slow, wet, rhythmic bulge shifted across her abdomen, and for the first time in her life, she felt a 10 by 10 space opening up inside her own ribs. The house hadn't been destroyed. It had just found a new set of blueprints.